everyone for joining. My name is Elisa Gilbert, as Fernando said, and I work at Ecofys. We're an energy and climate change consultancy. I'm based in our London office. I've been working here for 11 years, and now I'm in charge of our team that works on market-based mechanisms all around the world. It's my pleasure to present to you today the work that we have done, and earlier this year, we launched it in May 2014 at the Carbon Expo in Cologne. It's a report that we wrote for the World Bank, as Fernando said, for the second year in a row, and it's entitled State and Trends of Carbon Pricing. I'll start by giving you a little bit of a history of this report and what the new report, this one, contains, and then I'll try to highlight for you the main findings of this year's study, and hopefully I can highlight for you a little bit about what I think is going to happen in the future as well. Now, for several years in the past, the World Bank produced a report called the State and Trends of the Carbon Market, and that primarily looked at the prices, volume data, and information about the flexible trading mechanisms, primarily CDM, that were created by the Kyoto Protocol, and tried to provide information to all the players in that market about what to expect. Over recent years, and I'll talk a little bit more about this, the Kyoto markets have been plagued by several challenges, including a lack of demand and therefore low prices. And as a result, the World Bank wanted to change and move its lens a little bit and focus more on what was happening all around the world in terms of putting a price on carbon at the national level as well as the international level. And what resulted was the first version last year and the second version this year, which is an update on carbon pricing around the world. I would like to acknowledge the work that the World Bank put in to help us produce this, particularly Alex Kosoy at the World Bank, who was the officer in charge of this report, as well as several of my colleagues, Noemi Klein and Long Lam in particular, who contributed significant work to this project. Now, the purpose of this report, which is readily available online, is to provide both an encyclopedic reference, so something you can go back to and find out some detail on what's happening in these different carbon pricing systems, but also somehow an overview. And you'll see later on a map that we produced that I've seen in many, many other presentations since, which help provide an overview of carbon pricing systems around the world. And just so we're clear, what is a carbon pricing policy or carbon pricing system? That primarily in this context relates to emissions trading systems and carbon taxation. These are both policies that put a price on carbon and integrate it into the economy, and therefore into the decisions of consumers and producers alike. In this year's report, as Fernando pointed out, in 2014, we expanded our previous report, particularly in the area of carbon taxation. So we now cover, in this report, quite a bit of detail about carbon taxes around the world. So I'm going to start by talking to you a little bit about what we found or reported on in terms of the international carbon pricing situation, and then I'll step down into the national and regional level. So this next slide talks a little bit about the international context. As I said before, the Kyoto Protocol that was agreed in 2008 to 2012 set up the flexible mechanisms. These were CDM, JI, and AAU trading. CDM in particular grew to be an enormous market, and this market stimulated project-based emissions reductions all around the world. They were readily bought and sold to help countries meet their targets ultimately under the Kyoto Protocol. At the heart of a successful market system like the CDM was the demand. Countries needed to be signed up to emissions reduction goals and therefore be encouraged to buy credits to meet those goals. A particularly strong part of that was the EU emissions trading system, which fell within the EU set of policies to meet its Kyoto Protocol goal and was the main source of demand for many of the CERs, so CDM units. But if we're looking forward to the future, the Kyoto Protocol first period is now over, and what we really need to see is an international agreement that builds up demand for these market mechanisms in the future. And unfortunately, what we see is not very promising. 12% only of global GHG emissions are currently under Kyoto Protocol 2, and in fact, only 9 countries have ratified. And the only country with a CP2 target that has actually ratified the second trading period of the Kyoto Protocol is Monaco, which, as you can see, represents a really, really tiny proportion of global greenhouse gas emissions. So what is the message here? The message is that we still are in a bit of a dire straits situation with a lack of demand at the international level. This means that prospects for demand in the future of project-based CERs and so on are relatively few, and I'll come back to this a little bit later about what we can hope in terms of the future demand. However, it is worth reflecting a little bit about what we have had from CDM so far and what the current status is, in fact. So we know that the current CER price is extremely, extremely low, but what does it really look like? And at the top here, this graph seeks to show you a little bit, and I'll try to give you a pointer here. This part of the graph shows you the residual demand for CERs, so these are CDM credits for 2014 to 2020, cumulatively. So what we did was we looked at all of the trading systems around the world where either countries or companies are allowed to buy CER credits to meet their emissions objectives or compliance obligations. And we found that if you add up the demand that remains, it's in this region here of just over 1,000 megatons CO2 equivalent. So, for example, very important there is that the traditional source of demand, which was the EU ETS, as I said, a very large source of demand, not only have new rules been put in place that restrict the use of CERs in the EU ETS, but in addition, quite a bit of the existing allowance for the participants to use CERs has already actually been used up. So there was a limit to how many CERs could be imported into the EU ETS system, and quite a few of those have been used up already. Then here on the red bar, what you see is the full potential for issuance from 2014 to 2020, which is much, much greater than the demand. So you can see why the prices are so low. Demand is much lower than supply. And in addition, this is based here on the potential based on registered projects that are in operation right now. But actually, we know that if the carbon price went up, so if demand did indeed increase, then the potential could also increase even further, because some projects that are currently not viable at the prices we see now would also come online again. So this is a clear picture to show that as of the time that we wrote this report, there was clear evidence for the huge amount of supply and the much lower amount of demand. However, quite apart from how CDM is doing right now, it's important to note, and we measured this in the report, the actual success that CDM has seen so far. So you can talk about the success directly in terms of its goal of meeting emissions reductions. And you can see that over 1,400 megatons of carbon dioxide equivalent have been reduced so far, which is the equivalent of the annual emissions of Japan, which is pretty impressive. On top of that, nearly 8,000 projects or programs of activities have been registered in less than 10 years, and that's an amazing scaling of activity. It's an average of 2 projects per day. In addition, this is the investment of $130 billion in these greenhouse gas reduction activities, which is again incredibly high when you compare it to the total annual overseas development aid flow in 2011. And as I said before, the reason that there's demand for these credits is because many of the companies in the EU who have to meet compliance reduction obligations can do so by buying CERs instead of making reductions in their own factories. And the reason they do this is because it's cheaper to buy a CER than to invest in the technology in their own factory in many cases. And the estimate here of $6 to $28 billion is how much money those companies saved by choosing to buy a CER instead of making another investment. And that was one of the major reasons why in the EU emissions trading system you can buy these offsets. As part of the CDM, many renewable energy projects were approved, and that led to over 200 gigawatts of installed renewable energy capacity being put in place, and over 155 countries were involved in the CDM. So that was an enormous amount of success. On top of that, we can see other benefits not related to emissions trading. For example, significant sustainable development benefits related to poverty and also adaptation to climate change. And interestingly enough, at Ecofys, we're working on a project at the moment to try and understand what has happened to many CDM projects now that the price has really plummeted. And actually what you see is a continued success story in terms of emissions reductions, because many of those projects still continue to run. And that's not in the emissions reduction estimate that we include here. So it's not included in this number here. It's an additional benefit. So all in all, you could say that CDM has had enormous success. But as you can see from the graph here, its future is really uncertain. The main issue is that there isn't clear demand, neither from the big EU ETS demand center before, but also not from the overall global system. So the question is, does CDM actually have a future? And there are many efforts being made to refine and improve CDM to make sure that some of the least developed nations, which benefited less from CDM in the past, are prioritized if CDM develops in the future. And there's quite a lot that can be retained from the CDM mechanism and approach. So it's likely to be taken up further in the future in some shape or form. And I'll come on to this again a little bit later. So this is the international element. I want to move on now to what's happening in individual countries and regions. So what we can see is that at an international level, carbon markets aren't working so well at the moment. But what is interesting is that despite that, there's a growing increase in the development of emissions trading systems and carbon pricing schemes at the national, regional, and subnational level. And that's kind of exciting. So what you see is that many people embrace this still as really an important mechanism for reducing emissions cost effectively. This picture is meant to just show you something nice about the cover of our report. So the cover of our report is not random, and you could just appreciate that it's a randomized set of colored tiles, and each tile represents a unit of quantity covered by an emissions trading system. And you can see the color code there on the right-hand side. So it's just to give you a sort of a visual feel of these different markets and their relative size. So for example, if you see that dark blue color is Alberta, every time you see a dark blue unit, that's a relative scale of emissions covered by carbon pricing in Alberta. So when you hopefully get to see the hard copy of our report or download it, you can look at this picture again and think about its meaning. As I said earlier, carbon pricing is becoming more widely accepted. Carbon pricing here includes taxation and emissions trading systems, as I said before, and many, many more countries around the world are putting a price on carbon globally. So what we see here, as compared to last year, first of all, there's been a slight increase in the number of national and subnational regions that put a price on carbon. We're now at 40 national and over 20 subnational jurisdictions that put a price on carbon. When we look around the world, what's nice is that we see that these are very widely distributed around the world. So no continent is left untouched. We've had a bit of a backward step with Australia, but New Zealand is still in there since we did this first graph. So the first thing to taxation in here, so there's a nice mix of taxation and emissions trading systems. We also notice some overlap, so they can complement each other. So particularly in the northern European region up here, you can see quite a lot of combination of taxation and emissions trading systems used in locations. Then we see, of course, Africa here with South Africa having a system, quite a lot of discussion in South America, ongoing activity in North America, and a lot of activity in China around there, and also Southeast Asia. So that's the first two observations I would make. I would say also that this use of tax in combination with trading also maybe lays to rest this traditional debate that we have about whether carbon taxes or carbon trading are the most appropriate approaches to carbon pricing. How I like to see it is that it's quite tricky to get a carbon pricing system in place, and so the things that are most palatable to your government should be something that you take quite seriously. Of course, an emissions trading system has the advantage of guaranteeing the environmental outcome of the system, but without you knowing the price. Whereas with a taxation system, you can be certain about the price, but you can't be certain about the environmental outcome. So there will be some changes needed in both sets of systems in order to modify either the price or the environmental outcome, depending on the sensitivities of the electorate in those regions. Then the other thing I wanted to say while we're looking at this slide is I wanted to just talk a little bit about the context as we see it now internationally. So last week we had the UN Climate Summit in New York, which was relatively exciting. And this report was quoted, particularly this quote about the number of jurisdictions and regions putting a national carbon price into place. And there was a global carbon pricing statement, which was signed by over 73 national governments, 11 regional governments, and over 1,000 businesses. And this is really, really very powerful. This tells us that at a range of different levels, nations, regions, and businesses, there is support for carbon pricing. And that's because carbon pricing can deliver greenhouse gas emissions in a way that's most cost effective, and that's why it's supported by businesses in particular, as well as others. What that carbon pricing statement can also tell us, which is exciting, is that there may well be demand for more carbon pricing in the future and support from a lot of different areas. And it can tell us something about the direction that policies might take in the future, because with so many actors from different parts of the world in support of carbon pricing, we might expect to see even a further expansion than we've seen in 2014. Another comment that I would make, though, looking at this map, is that we've stepped from the slide before where I spoke about what's happening globally to show you what's happening at national or sub-regional level. And you can characterize this as fragmentation in a way. We've had a change from a very flourishing international carbon market to something that's really defined very differently in different parts of the world. This fragmented approach can give benefits and also disadvantages, and we should consider both of those. The benefits of fragmentation is that it shows a real commitment at the levels of each of these jurisdictions that they think that this policy approach is important and viable. And it also allows for flexibility and consideration of national circumstances, maybe more so than an international system. But of course, with a more fragmented approach, what you do lose is consistency and harmonization. And later on, when people want to understand that their commitments or their mutual commitments are equivalent, that becomes more difficult. It also becomes quite challenging for multinational corporations operating in this kind of a policy landscape. So there are both pros and cons, I think, of this kind of approach that we see now. Also, I think what's interesting to observe is that with the introduction of many new carbon pricing systems, there's a lot that the old ones can learn from. So the EU emissions trading system was really the flagship emissions trading system. But there's also some very interesting innovation going on, particularly in these 7 Chinese pilot regions here. And that provides quite a lot for other systems to think about and learn from. So now moving on from this overarching map on carbon pricing, and let's see what has been significant about 2014 in terms of emissions trading systems in particular. I think the biggest, most important thing is that in 2013, so our 2014 report talks about 2013, in 2013, we saw 8 new carbon markets open and more planned for 2014, and that's really quite exciting. And what's also particularly notable here is that those markets were in China and in the US and North America. So these are parts of the world that really have a significant greenhouse gas emissions challenge, and they were deciding to tackle that, at least in some parts of those countries, by using carbon pricing. That's very significant. And if you add up the value of all of these markets, it's around $30 billion US. So that's by taking, at the time of the report, the carbon price in each of those jurisdictions and multiplying it by the quantity of emissions covered. So here we see that in the beginning of 2013, we had the Californian cap and trade system come on board, as well as Quebec and Kazakhstan. And then gradually over the course of 2013, we had different pilot schemes in China come on board, starting with Shenzhen in June 2013, and then followed by Chongqing a bit later on this year already. And when we look forward to 2015, we expect the introduction of the Korean ETS as well as quite a significant system. So this is showing continued growth of the emissions trading system markets in particular. If I move on to the next slide. I think what's notable, as I said earlier, is that we see that the trading system or the international carbon market has suffered quite a lot of challenges recently. And yet despite that, people continue to endorse local emissions trading systems. We have, as I said, as I sort of alluded to earlier, unfortunately lost Australia from this mix, and they continue to put into place some types of carbon pricing systems, but they avoid particularly market-based measures at the moment, and that's for political reasons. But what we can see here is that emissions trading systems are used pretty widely, with the biggest in the European Union, which is developing a link close to finalization, I believe, with Switzerland. We have really significant developments with the pilot regions now on track in China, and the emergence of the Korean market and several different systems in Japan. We also have the clearly stated plans from China to develop an emissions trading system nationally by 2016. And I was just in China recently providing some capacity building training on their systems there. And many people keep asking me, well, do you think it's really going to happen, a Chinese trading system for 2016? And I really think it will. I think you can see that that there's a lot already in place. For example, monitoring, reporting, and verification rules are starting to become established. And also the intention is to develop a framework for the national system and gradually bring on board different regions of China over time. And I think that's a very realistic way to make the system work more effectively. And already many of those regional governments are being appraised, and that's part of what we did in our capacity building, of what this will mean for them. So that's really pretty powerful if we can imagine a Chinese system coming on board gradually over the course of 2016 and maybe shortly afterwards. It's also interesting indeed that China has chosen this approach as their greenhouse gas reduction mechanism. Another interesting development that a lot of people have been talking about in recent times, around the time of the publishing of this report, was the new rules in the U.S. about Section 111D, which restrict emissions on existing power plants. And this has opened up, again, the debate in the U.S., primarily at state level, about what different kinds of policies can reduce emissions, particularly in existing power plants. And some states at least are considering whether or not they should take on board the experiences of the California cap and trade system and also the RGGI system, which use a flexible carbon pricing mechanism to actually encourage those reductions. So those two overarching developments provide some clues to what might happen with ETS in the future. We've had a bit of a change of pace from last year in terms of linking. So last year there did seem to be a pattern of increased linking activity, with the EU announcing its potential link to Australia and Switzerland having announced its link to the EU. But things have really slowed in terms of linking this year, with the exception of the firm link confirmed between California and Quebec. And I think this could be for a few reasons. First of all, to make a link work between two emissions trading systems, there has to be benefits for both sides, or the systems need to be incredibly well aligned. And I think you saw with California and Quebec that a link was established between their emissions trading systems because the building blocks of the systems were identical. In fact, what happened was the Western Climate Initiative was set up as a group of provinces and states in North America to start developing the basis for an emissions trading system. Several states and provinces were involved, and they developed the basic underpinning. But in the end, only Quebec and California implemented it. But it means that their legislation and also many of the design decisions of their systems are identical, and that made it much easier to forge a connection. For many of the other systems, there's much greater differences, but also some political differences. And in the European Union and Switzerland case, the link has taken much longer to establish than anyone imagined. And that's despite the fact that the systems are incredibly similar. And with Australia and the European Union, the link fell apart once the new Australian government got in and declared that they would be abolishing the carbon pricing mechanism, which they now have done. So this means that while we see a nice bottom-up development of these markets around the world, it may be some time before we see this idea of linked markets, where they all come together to create a global market from the bottom up. Actually, we may see this kind of diversity perpetuating for quite a bit longer. If I move on to the next slide, this again is a graphic that shows you the growth of the global emissions being covered by emissions trading systems. So on the left-hand side, you can see how many global emissions are covered. So here, that's this axis here. And here the bars show you over time how the emissions trading systems have gradually covered more and more scope. So there are some small ones in here, a Tokyo one and a few other cities in Japan, but over time you see these significant increases here of the Chinese pilots in 2013 and 2014, and then later on in 2015 and 2016 you see this increase in scope in both Quebec and California, where their systems go from covering 30 to 35% of their emissions to also covering, particularly importantly, transport fuels upstream. And once they're included in the systems, you see a huge increase in the emissions covered by these systems overall. So we still see a plan to increase the share of emissions covered by ETSs to around 9% or so in 2015 and onwards. And that's based on current plans. So there's still the potential to expand this further. Now, moving on to the next slide, we can talk a little bit now about carbon taxes. As I said earlier, this report treated carbon taxes in much more detail than we did in the 2013 report. That's for a variety of reasons. First of all, we wanted to be more even-handed. We felt like it's important that we talk about carbon pricing systems equally, but also because there's been some more interest in carbon taxes recently. So some countries have introduced new ones. Mexico and France both introduced new carbon taxes since we published the report the year before. But also there's been some change of policy. For example, in Chile, previously committed to an emissions trading system, very rapidly on the introduction of a new government, changed their policy to the introduction of a carbon tax. As I said earlier, I don't think it's important either way if you say one is better than the other. I kind of explained the differences earlier. What's exciting is that many of these emerging economies, as they get stronger, are putting indeed a carbon pricing system in place, be that a tax or emissions trading system. In South Africa, we've seen that they're still developing quite carefully their carbon tax plans, which should come on force sometime in 2016. And they've explicitly stated that they choose a carbon tax right now, but that it could provide an opportunity to move into an ETS eventually. They currently choose a carbon tax for a range of reasons, including their development status, but also focusing on the fact that they have very few players in their energy market, and they don't believe that there are enough actors in general that would provide the kind of market liquidity that they would need for a successful functioning emissions trading system that develops the appropriate and strong carbon price. So there's reasons why people have chosen carbon pricing. In Australia, too, the taxation mechanism was meant to be a step towards an emission trading system, so getting people used to the price and then providing some flexibility. However, in Europe, what you see is many complementary taxes. So many of the taxes in Europe cover carbon for the sectors that are not covered by the EU emissions trading system. And so it really is a misnomer that taxes and trade can't go together. And in addition, there has been taxation introduced. For example, in the UK, there's a carbon price floor, which actually directly covers sectors that are also covered in the EU emissions trading system. And that's because currently the carbon price is not considered strong enough to achieve all of the objectives that the UK government wants it to achieve in the UK. There's some concern that this kind of fragmented taxation approach will distort what's meant to be a very harmonized emissions trading system in Europe. And in fact, it will lead to the emissions reductions targets being achieved, but not at the exact lowest cost across Europe, because there'll be a different signal in the UK, a slightly different price signal for some of the actors in the UK. I think it's also nice to note that the border between carbon taxation and emissions trading systems are starting to be blurred a little bit. So the distinction is not, in a way, as clear as it once was, because some of the features of these carbon tax measures reflect a little bit the features that you see in emissions trading system. Most notable of these is the use of offsets that are being proposed both for the Mexican tax and in the South African tax. This directly mirrors the way that offsets can be used in the emissions trading system to ease the burden on compliance participants, but also it reflects a trend in the emission trading systems to use offsets in a domestic context to encourage emissions reductions in the same jurisdiction in regions that are not covered by the tax or the ETS. So that would mean that offsets, for example, in the South African system could only be used if the reductions were also made in South Africa. And in addition, the benefit of some of these taxes, and in fact another parallel between emissions trading system, is that a tax is clearly a revenue generator. And in the emissions trading system, there's quite a lot of use of free allocation, particularly at the beginning of the system, or for sectors that are exposed to international competitiveness, to protect against international competitiveness. And there's some revenues generated from auctions. With a tax, the revenues are, of course, fully generated, and then can be recycled in a way that can address a whole load of concerns, some related to emissions reductions, so stimulating further emissions reductions, but some related to other political imperatives in those countries. So we see some parallels there between the different systems. An important lesson that we took away from this year's report was about prices. So this graph should demonstrate to you the range of prices that we saw in all of the carbon pricing systems we covered in the report. As you can see, they range quite significantly from $1 per ton carbon at the bottom, which is the Mexican carbon tax and the New Zealand ETS, all the way up to $168 per ton of carbon with the Swedish carbon tax at the top. So, well, what can we say about this? First of all, we can certainly say that there's a great deal of variety. So this in itself is interesting because the main purpose of a carbon pricing system is to price the environmental externality cost, so the cost of environmental damage into goods and services. And at a purely academic level, there should be an ideal carbon price globally that reflects the damage we do to our planet every time we emit carbon. This figure is not sort of agreed upon yet, but also it's clear that it's not consistently reflected in all of the systems at all. So that's the first thing, that there's increased range and a lot that needs to be learned about where this price needs to be set. Second of all, what you can see is a kind of clustering below the sort of around $12 level of the ETS system. So in general, as a general statement, the ETS systems seem to deliver lower carbon prices than the taxes. There are many reasons that we could think about for this. First of all, that's the purpose of an emissions trading system. It's meant to actually deliver the environmental goal at the lowest possible cost. And so to a certain extent, low prices can be a signature for success in an emissions trading system. On the other hand, it could also be that there are different sectors targeted by each of these policies. So we're not looking at a consistent picture. And it may be that often the carbon taxes target, for example, the transport sector, emissions that are really hard to stimulate reduction of. So there's also other reasons why we could see this real variety of price. And it could also really relate to the ambition of the system. So if you have an emissions trading system, if you set a very tight cap, so you really tighten the supply of emissions allowances as compared to what you would expect emissions to be otherwise, the so-called business as usual emissions, that kind of real tight market could lead to quite a high price. But poor ambition would not do so. So increased ambition could also lead to increased prices. But you can also see that in Europe and also in the REGI region, some unexpected dips in demand for allowances meant that initial estimates of how ambitious a market would be were wrong. So there's been a real dive in the EU emissions trading system price, and that was a result primarily of the recession in 2008 to sort of 2010-11-ish. That hadn't been factored into the cap size. So there's quite low prices in those systems. REGI managed to cut the cap size significantly on the basis of the emissions reductions achieved so far and the low prices. And that actually caused an increase in the REGI price straight away. And there are now debates about reforming the emissions trading system right now in Europe to try and create a way of sending a stronger price signal and redressing the supply-demand imbalance right now. So ambition, but also mismatches between supply and demand that are not predicted or predictable can lead to low prices. And by increasing ambition over time, there could be increased prices that will also deliver greater emissions reductions. Also, in some of the newer systems, particularly in China, there's not a lot of price data so far. So in those markets that are quite new, relatively illiquid, that means there aren't very many traders on the market right now, the price might not actually reflect the economic fundamentals, and it's not a mature market yet. So we can expect more development there. There's been a lot of effort put into the Chinese systems in particular to encourage people to actually trade. But there is a wide observation in Europe, but also in those Chinese systems, that for many of the participants who are required to surrender allowances at the end of each year, not all of them actively actually engage in trading. And some more active engagement in trading is necessary to develop a mature market and also signal the right carbon price signal, and in fact to achieve the emissions reductions at the most cost-effective manner. Finally, and clearly, these prices reflect a range of political realities and goals. So as I said before, one of the reasons why a country might introduce a carbon tax is because they have a very rapid development trajectory, or they also have poverty issues they need to deal with, or they're very concerned about the competitiveness of their industry. And for all those reasons, it may not be sound for those countries to introduce a high carbon price. They might want to start with a lower carbon price to enable a smooth transition to a low carbon economy. So these different political realities, which really vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, can also influence the price. So I think there's much more to be said about pricing in these systems, but for this year's report, we wanted to at least provide a clear visual and accurate understanding of how prices compare to each other. So where does this leave us all then globally? Well, pretty clear, this map shows greenhouse gas emissions per country in different sort of different tranches. But we have a serious problem on our hands in terms of climate change and emissions reductions. And the only way to achieve the reductions that we need to achieve is for as many policies and instruments as we can think of to be deployed. So it's good news that we're using a lot of these market-based instruments bottom-up. It's excellent news that last week in New York, many different stakeholders signed up to carbon pricing. But eventually, there needs to be some kind of cooperation. So this goes back both to the discussion that I brought up earlier about linking systems together. I think we'll see a dispersed approach for quite some time and quite a lot of variety. But eventually, things need to build up into a coherent global picture of many jurisdictions all making some kind of comparable effort. How can that be done in the space of diversity and a degree of fragmentation? Well, linking is one way, but also dialogue and coordination in the market is also very important. So the approach that California and Quebec took of developing their system in a coordinated manner is quite powerful, and they're actually actively trying to recruit new members who can create similar markets and join them. But also initiatives like the World Bank's Partnership for Market Readiness, which is an ongoing program to develop pathways towards markets and carbon pricing, is also very powerful, because that platform also allows for south-south sharing as well as south-north sharing on the development of emissions trading systems, but also other carbon pricing mechanisms. And by sharing information, then a more coordinated approach can be taken, and that can also allow for eventually a more global-looking picture. The second part of this future would be, in a way, a rejuvenation of this international carbon market that I spoke about at the beginning. There's still some appetite for that, but it really depends on the decisions that governments make about their overall targets and their commitment to climate change reduction in general, and that will really become clearer throughout 2015 and culminating in the next Conference of the Parties, the Conference of the Parties in Paris in 2015. Lima will be a stepping stone to that later this year. And those agreements in 2015 will determine the long-term goals of countries, and it will also set out a little bit more clearly the role of carbon pricing within an international strategy. And that could be a role for the CDM or for a new market mechanism that builds on CDM, as well as long-term signals about what the overall global goal is. For example, a continued commitment to reaching the 2-degree limit only of temperature increase in the world. And hopefully the 2015 agreement will also bring some incremental targets at different country levels that can also start to signal perhaps demand for some kind of carbon pricing instrument. So with that, I hope that we see such developments in 2015, and I hope that I'm able to present this on the report to you all next year. This time, in our report, you can also find a lot of more information about the detail of different systems. Here's a summary of the different carbon pricing instruments that we reported upon, and I would encourage you to go to the World Bank or Ecofys website and download the report if you want to read more. There's many more details available there. And I'm happy now to pass back over to Fernando and answer any questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Alicia, for this very interesting presentation. Let's maybe now move to the new layout, including the questions and answers. Sorry. So I think we already have some questions going in. So let me just go through a few of them. Okay. Okay, so there is a first question or comment from Atef Zayed. What does it take to include Egypt and Saudi Arabia to the trading system? I don't know whether the question is clear enough.